I went back to my office, and it was at that moment, 9:02 a.m., that there was a thump, a percussion, if you will, on the bulletproof glass in the governor's office. And I knew some horrific event had happened, a fuel explosion, a tanker, or something like that. But then all the agony began. But that's where I was that morning.
As Frank referenced, I was in Tulsa. We actually had sold our house because we had a ninth grader living in Oklahoma City, and we decided that he needed to become part of the Oklahoma City community and that we wouldn't be spending much time in Tulsa. And I was there packing things and getting ready for the movers that arrived that morning when the phone rang, probably a little after 9:06, 9:10, the minute that it was up on the air from Debbie Snodgrass, an Oklahoma City resident and a friend of mine, and she called and she said, "You have the TV on?" And I said, "No." And she said, "There's been a gas explosion." The initial reports from the media were that there had been a natural gas explosion at the Federal Building. And so I turned the TV on and watched, like everybody else did, everything else unfold. And by 11 o'clock, I stopped. I was supposed to be giving a speech that morning at Philbrook Art Museum, and I stopped on the way saying, "Please put all these people in your prayers for a safe rescue and recovery," and drove back to Oklahoma City. So spent the whole time on the phone. Remember those great big cell phones? On the cell, calling, saying they need blood, they need water, they need this, that, and the other, because that's what the radio said they needed. And by the time, the phone call was made, they'd come on the radio and say, "We have all the people lined up to give blood. We don't need any more, water, et cetera, et cetera."
The beginning of the Oklahoma Standard.
That was the beginning of the Oklahoma City Standard, and the giving spirit of Oklahoma is, unfolded from the get-go.
Right at the outset, we didn't know, obviously, what had happened, but when a news helicopter was over the site, you could tell the building was blown in half. At first, it was allegedly the federal courthouse. When they said, no, it was the federal office building, I knew at that hour in the morning it was filled with people, and it was. And shortly thereafter, I went over to the command center, which is underneath the ground. We had a command center, obviously, anticipating tornadoes. And President Bill Clinton, who went to school with me, I'm 2 years older, at Georgetown University, he called to ask what was it and what happened and what do we need. And we went through all of the things that we thought that we would need, FEMA help, for example, because Oklahoma City had 1,000 firefighters. And if that was as horrific a blast as it looked from the outside, we could have had and did have hundreds of casualties and hundreds of deaths. And of course, Mr. Clinton, I say this as a Republican, he was the best of best Democrats because he provided instant assistance. I remember he made a comment at the end of our conversation. He said, I just hope it's not a Middle East terrorism event. And of course, I never thought of anything like that. Although the World Trade Center, the first bombing of the World Trade Center 2 years before our own experience in Oklahoma City was a Middle Eastern event, but that wasn't a universal fear or universally discussed. But for that moment on, it was all hands on deck and a real horrible, horrific day and week for all of us.
Two postscripts to Frank's comments. First of all, Bill Clinton genuinely cared about the people. And it was all about the people. How can we help the people? And what people talked about Bill Clinton, publicly, he'd meet somebody, never forget their name. Well, you go behind closed doors when you're in meetings and whatnot. And that's the real deal. I mean, that is really how he is. He has a huge heart and concern for others. But the other thing is that it's rarely discussed is the Oklahoma City firefighters had been training for, tornadoes and horrible natural disasters, because Oklahoma was right in the midst of Tornado Alley. And they had been in really, really extensive training. So when this happened, they were so skilled and so prepared for a natural disaster that they were able to take those skills on and apply them to a man-made disaster. And the FEMA teams all kept saying, oh my God.
Those are teams from the U.S. government that started
Federal
coming,
Emergency Management.
That evening and the next morning.
And they kept saying, we're really kind of the backup to the Oklahoma City Fire Department and the police department, quite truthfully, because they are so trained, they are so skilled, they're so capable. And that's the part of the story you don't really hear a lot about. And that's part of the Oklahoma Standard and the Oklahoma story that, we want to continue to tell people, because we have an extraordinary state filled with extraordinary people. And that was showing us at our very best.
Well, we have several questions from viewers, and one of those is regarding the Oklahoma Standard. As the governor and first lady for the state of Oklahoma in 1995, can you explain what the Oklahoma Standard meant to you in the days following the bombing and what it means to you today?
Well, in my case, what does a governor do? It was a big question mark, because I wasn't the fire chief or the police chief or the FEMA head. And it was important to know.
Nothing like this had ever occurred before.
Well, that's right. But it's important to note that the Oklahoma Standard began with highly competent people in charge of challenges, like the head of the National Guard, like the chief of police, as Cathy said, in Oklahoma City, the fire chief and the like. They were first-rate professionals. This matter didn't have to be taken out of their hands. And I had just appointed the National Guard commander, a major general who already was a major general, an ace of aces in Vietnam. And Steve Courtwright was just a first-rate professional. And all of the people who were preparing for tornadoes now prepared for something that was unanticipated. How do you prepare for that? And they went to work. And interestingly, a few years ago, I was in Washington, and I don't know if it was James Lee Whitwu, who was the FEMA director at the time of our tragedy, but one of the senior executives from the government said, you guys ought to be proud of yourselves. That standard you talk about is true, because Oklahoma is the only state, Oklahoma City, the only city in the last 30 years that was totally and fully in charge of the response. Everybody else queued up behind them and worked for them. That isn't the case, wasn't the case, for example, in Hurricane Katrina. The Federals took it over right away. And that's a great compliment to the state of Oklahoma, to Cathy's point.
But, I think the Oklahoma Standard actually came to fruition when the first FEMA team from Arizona was getting ready to leave. And Frank and I were told they were leaving. It would be their last dinner. They were having underneath the parking lot at Southwestern Bell. Salvation Army had provided the food. And we went to thank them.
And that's now the law school, OCU Law School building.
And we went to thank them for coming and, for all their professionalism, et cetera, et cetera. And it was very dangerous. It was a very dangerous undertaking, because the building was in jeopardy of collapsing, because the integrity of the structure had been shattered with the bomb. And one of the FEMA workers pulled out $1 and said, Governor, do you know what this is? And you said,
I said, oh, I'm in politics. I know what a dollar bill is. He said, this is the dollar I brought with me. It's the exact same dollar I'm leaving with. I never had to spend a nickel on anything. In those days, pre-cell phone, they had all access to telephonic conversations with their families. Every time they went out to dinner, the bill never came. That was something they always said to me. One of those fellas from one of those teams said, when we were in New York for that first World Trade Center bombing, we had to pay $5 for a sack of ice. In Oklahoma City, you didn't pay for anything. You go out to dinner, the check never came. You had massages, you had telephones, you had laundry, any equipment that you needed was free of charge. It really was an extraordinary statement of goodness and charity and sharing on the part of the Oklahoma City family.
Well, the convention center was converted to a bed and breakfast, really. You know, cots were put up immediately for the FEMA team and for the Oklahoma City Fire Department who might need to come and rest before their shifts went back out. But outside of that, there was a Walmart, Target, convenience store with everything, anything and everything, food, clothing, aspirin, and as Frank said, masseuses and free telephone and barbers and anything and everything that was needed. And one of the guys came out after the first night and said, the only thing that's missing is a mint on our pillow. And so the next night there were mints on their pillow and roses. And you know, we can all kind of giggle and laugh about that now, but the truth is, when they came off their shift, it was such a horrific experience for all of them, that those little touches actually made a huge difference in their lives. And so when they left, everybody started talking about, this only happens in Oklahoma. This, nowhere else has this ever occurred anywhere. And that's when the Oklahoma Standard was born, and it all came together. And what it meant to us at the time is it made us enormously proud to be Oklahomans, number one, which we already were. But when you see Oklahomans coming together like that, it changes your life forever, and you never forget that. And what it means to us today is they've taken that standard to heart, which actually is what built our state. Really, it's the, you know, the grit and the never giving up and the spirit of community that built Oklahoma. But we have taken it to another level with everything that we're doing. We saw it during COVID. When we're tested and tried, the Oklahoma Standard just, you know, surfaces and comes to life, and it reminds all of us that we are an extraordinary state. We are the heart of the heartland.
And remember, and it's important to point this out, even though this tragedy was over 25 years ago, but I'm a former FBI agent. Today, the largest criminal case investigated in the history of the United States was the Oklahoma City bombing. Remember, 9/11, there was no one to prosecute. So in the case of the Oak City bombing, this was the largest criminal case and the largest lives lost, the largest property damage of a domestic terrorism case. And how did we all respond? Part of that standard is to recognize that the men and women who came here were shattered by what they saw. This is something you can't get used to. In New York, for example, when an airplane hits a building, tragically, everybody's black powder. I mean, everything was burned up, and the human bodies were people who jumped off the building or buildings to get away from the fires. Here, 168 of our neighbors and friends, including 19 children and some 400 other people, were all there in the flesh. And the first morning when Kathy and I went down to the site, a firefighter was coming up the street. I didn't recognize his uniform. Obviously, he was a FEMA member from some state that had come the night before. And I stepped into the street and I said, "Thank you so much for being here." And he said, "Who are you?" And I said, "Well, I'm the governor." I would think he would say, "Oh, well, thanks. Nice to meet you. It's nice to be here," and walk on. But he didn't. He took his finger and stuck it in my chest. And he said, "Then you find out who did this, because the only thing I pulled from that rubble was a child's finger and an American flag." I mean, he was completely emotionally distraught. And that happened repeatedly by these individuals who just simply were shattered by what they saw.
You know, the other thing too is, you know, the families who lost loved ones are in the heart of the story. And, you know, we can never make that right for any of them. But through their grieving process, through Bob Johnson's leadership and Kerry Watkins, who was fresh out of journalism school, leadership for the Oklahoma City National Memorial, they pulled all the families together, and the memorial that exists today is their handiwork. It's what they wanted, and they helped guide the process and were a part of that process every step of the way, which I just can't imagine how painful that would have been for them, and the grief that they were personally experiencing. You know, whether you're an adult, a person, Frank and my age, who lost your adult child, or whether you were a young person and you lost your little children, your babies, 19 children, little children, 230 children lost one or both parents, and those were school-age children. And that doesn't factor in all the other statistics of the, you know, older people losing older children, et cetera, et cetera. Those families knitted together seamlessly to build something on the heels of a tragedy, which that also had never been done anywhere in the world. And it really is an extraordinary way to tell Oklahoma's story with a meaning. Don't let this happen again. There are other ways to do things.
Kath, mentioning, as I did earlier, the Middle East terrorism event, we didn't want to nor need to jump to conclusions. We would find out who did it, and it was a white fall-away Catholic who looked like any of us up here. But the reality is that action and the fact that I said on television that don't jump to conclusions. We have a lot of wonderful Muslim families, Muslim citizens of Oklahoma City that are good people. Let's just let the facts come out. The first major gift we got for the Victims Fund was $16,000. 25 was it, from the victims, from the Muslim community of Oklahoma City. And I made a battlefield decision that if you lost your kids, we would bury your kids and give you counseling. If your children lost you, we would put your children through college and graduate school, anywhere they wanted to go. And I know Kathy would agree with me. We had hundreds going to school at one time. We had a huge reception at the governor's mansion for all these college students, and they are still going. A number of them are still going to school, and none of them are still receiving mental as well as physical care, all from these contributions that came from all over the world to assist the victims and their families.
Well, now let's talk about your book. How did the idea for Love Won the Oklahoma Standard come about, and what do you hope the book conveys?
Let me let Kathy answer that. I was just a dray horse in the process. We went to Colorado for
wait,
skiing.
let's tell how it came about.
Okay, and then as the dray horse, I'll jump in and discuss some of the particulars.
Actually, I met with Terry Watkins, who remains the executive director of the Oklahoma City National Memorial, and Bob Ross one morning in anticipation of the 25th anniversary, the remembrance of the Oklahoma City bombing of April 19, 1995. And we were talking about different things. They were throwing out ideas and kind of asking for my reaction, my input. Not that it really mattered, but I was honored to be included. And Carrie said, "Why don't you and Frank write a book?" And I said, well, I have already written a book on In Their Name, and right on the heels of the bombing. And I said, let me think about it. And I hadn't been away for 2 seconds from our breakfast meeting, that I called her and I said, I think it should be about the children. We received, and I was the keeper of all the letters that came in, whether they were for architectural ideas for the site of the bombing, which I then turned all those over to Bob Johnson, or for the letters for the children, and letters and pictures and teddy bears that were sent. Anything that was sent, they came to the governor's office, and I read every one of them. The hospital rooms, the 5 children who were badly injured but who survived, their glass was covered, little PJ Allen, covered with notes and photos and pictures that children had drawn saying, please get well, we're praying for you. And Carrie said, talk to Frank, which I did. You thought it was a great idea.
Mm-hmm.
Carrie and the National Memorial had archived all the letters, all the pictures, and the archivist went through the thousands of them, and there really were thousands, and culled it down to what, Frank, about 150, 200 for us to go through. And we were invited to join our children in Colorado for Christmas.
Well, and the dray horse here, that is I, when we got to Crested Butte, our daughter Carrie and her husband and family, Kathy and all the gang went skiing. I had almost killed myself in a skiing accident a few years before. So I took all of these letters and children's art that Kathy had pulled together and culled it, looked at all of it, culled it. And when they came off the mountains, I say, okay, here are the photographs. Here are the letters. What do you think? Here's how we ought to put this thing together. And we did. And so
really, with the exception of like 2 or 3 that you had chosen,
yeah,
we were right on board. And I went through the others later, and I think I found a couple that I thought were appropriate that I added. Probably more female than male.
Well, because some of them obviously had a lot of color, which was important. Some of them had a lot of feeling, which was very important. And they were from all over the United States and all age groups. So I think it was really important for Kathy and me, and we did do it, to cull it on that basis.
And then you started, and then we presented it to Carrie Watkins and Jenny Moore Campbell. I did it again. To Jenny Moore Campbell from the Oklahoma Hall of Fame, who writes and publishes a lot of Oklahoma's stories. And they kind of looked at the photos, and then they kind of gave us the go-ahead. Frank did the first draft of all the writing, because you just write so beautifully. I can't write nearly as well as you do.
No, well, you have enormous talent, sweetie. But here is an example.
I added more adjectives.
Well, you did. And I don't know if y'all can see this very well, but certainly you ought to get a copy of this book, because the proceeds go to the Oklahoma City National Memorial, which is important, and the Hall of Fame. But here is an example of photographs of children at the fence putting up memorial memories. Here are some of the stories, or excuse me, the artwork of the children from all over the United States. Here, this child's from Glen Ellen, Illinois. What age? Doesn't say, just a middle school. And then the last of the writing is where, as Jenny asked, where the words "loved one" came from. The last of the writing says, the new Oklahoma City will never forget the old. The victims will not be forgotten. They remain tightly in our hearts. The Oklahoma standard, service, honor, and kindness continues today. Love one. And I think that's a very powerful statement of our brotherhood and sisterhood for those and with those who are involved in tragedy.
And it's timely. You know, we're in a very tumultuous time in American history. And I think the story of the Oklahoma City bombing is almost more relevant today, as there's a different way you can approach change than through violence. And kindness and service and love is a much better tool for negotiation in most cases. So the truth is, these children said things that just made you cry. They were so profound, and they were so deep, and they were so full of hope and prayer and love, that when we finally got to do this book, it was like it kind of had finally reached the crescendo of importance, because out of the mouth of babes, children see things, hear things, and honestly report their feelings to you, that as we get older, we seem to shelter those feelings. And so we were happy to do it. It's a great message for kids. This book is. It's a great message for adults.
To that end, we have a question. Do you remember the first time you saw one of the pieces, a letter, card, memento, picture? How did it make you feel then? And 25 years later, when pulling the images for the book, how did those feelings change? Do you view the pictures and letters differently today?
Yeah.
Well, I tried to be strong. So did you in public. We cried behind the scenes. I mean, you know, the emotion was raw. Frank knew several people in the building. I was particularly moved by the loss of children whose lives had not gotten to sprout yet. And so when I started reading the letters, and the letters were, I hope you find everybody, because they started coming in immediately. School-age children, whole classrooms drawing pictures and sending them saying, we're praying for you, we're hopeful for you, we're sending our love to you. Please don't let this happen again. So when I started opening those letters, and I was in my office doing so, the emotion just broke through. And there were lots and lots of tears. They were tears of gratitude, tears of loss, tears of deep sadness, and it gave me a way really to privately experience my grief. And so for the children, I was particularly grateful that they gave me that opportunity for grieving. The healing actually is a year-by-year experience, even for us, because different things will trigger our emotions from 1995, and often going through the museum is difficult for us because we see the museum, and now that I can actually, you know, go to what the children did for us, that brings such hope and heart to mind that it's very healing, and we continue to heal. You know, I remember the first person who ever said to me, when will you all be over this? And I thought, well, maybe never. And now I can take the maybe away. I don't think any of those family members ever get over the loss of their loved one. And I think the community will never, ever get over the loss of not only loved ones, but the impact this had on them. And you don't let it defeat you. You go forward. The kids said it best, love won. I mean, they truthfully showed us to be strong. They counted on us. And now they're the next generation, and we're counting on them to carry the mantle forward of the Oklahoma Standard, of hope and resilience and peace. And I don't know. Frank?
Well, for those of our listeners and viewers who haven't had an opportunity to visit the memorial, it's really important to visit it because it was designed by two then architectural students from the University of Oklahoma in a competition, a blind competition. The design was selected. And it really is quite remarkable. These young people were from Germany. They remained in the United States, live in Oklahoma, and are in the architectural business, if you will, and also teach, which is hugely significant. I think the young man is now dean of the school at the architectural school at OU. But in any event,
they were young.
Yeah, they were at the time, really young. They were students. But there was a gentleman by the name Charles Gibson, I think.
Charlie Gibson.
Charlie Gibson from ABC. And he told me at the time, he was a very prominent newsman, he was coming for the opening of the Memorial Museum, and certainly the chairs that were spread all over the site.
He was coming for that was phase one.
Dedication.
The dedication of the chairs.
Right. And he said there was a young woman picking up her bag at the airport here in Oklahoma City as he was picking up his. And she looked over and said, "Oh, you're Charlie Gibson." He said, "Yes, I am." And he said, "Are you a journalist as well?" And she said, No, I lost my dad in the bombing, and I'm coming to be here for the dedication of the memorial, what you would see from the outside. And of course, Gibson had no idea that these were chairs with the names of each of the victims, little chairs for children and large chairs for adults. And this woman said, her father was a Secret Service agent. This woman said, oh, and he said, well, I'm very sorry. I'm so sorry for you. And he said, what? She said, well, I understand and I appreciate that, but this is really a wonderful warm day for my sister and me. We're going to be able to sit in our dad's lap for the last time. And this was because of the chairs. And no one had a clue at the time what she was talking about, but obviously Charlie shortly afterwards did.
And really, to Jenny's question, children continue to impact. They still send letters. They participate in all the educational programming here. They'll put things on the fence that was initially surrounding the site is now it's a long fence. And so the impact of children continues.
Talking about the memorial, here's a question. When you entered the Oklahoma City National Memorial Museum for the first time, how did it make you feel? Did you tour with a group or alone?
Well, I don't remember whether it was a group or alone, but I'm sure it was with a group at the time. But for me, it was jarring because when you go in, you sit down and immediately there is a conversation from the Water Resources Board recorded that morning, and a woman is saying, now this is a hearing involving X, Y, and Z, and at 9:02 a.m. you just hear this thunderous clap. Then all the lights come on in the little auditorium, and then you move into the museum itself, which is really very, very jarring, but very powerful because that's what everyone went through. That's what everybody saw. And, a lot of us who were there and were obviously just crestfallen because, as Cathy said, I knew quite a few of the people who worked in the building. A number of those agencies reported to me nationally, like the U.S. Secret Service. I was general counsel and the deputy secretary of HUD, and we lost really everybody in the HUD office. It was terrible. But love won, though, because all of us have come together, all these children who have gone to college, all of the memories of their parents and grandparents. That's something you can't forget.
It's, it just can't help but not grab at your every emotion. And I think the first time we went through, I could hardly breathe. My throat was so tight and I was fighting the tears. And I do believe we were with a group. I remember the second time was when President Bush came to dedicate the memorial itself, the building. And we were on the dais, and afterwards, one of the Secret Service wives, whom I just loved and adored, came up to me. And I fought the tears the whole time during the dedication. She said, Cathy, you need to go talk to somebody. You clearly are grief-stricken. I said, oh, don't be silly, don't be silly. But I think the whole community was. I don't think it was just one person. I think everybody was shattered by the deed of a very evil man and how it impacted families and loved ones in our community. But 5 years, I guess it was several years later when we were waiting for the jury to come back after Timothy McVeigh's trial in Colorado. And it came back Kerry Watkins reached out to us and said, please come down to the survivor tree. And I called Frank and I said, come to the survivor tree. We're going to be there when they announce the jury's decision. And I said, Kerry, you need to get a can of spray paint because the saying that was put on the side of the building, we thought by the FEMA team, Team 5, later found out it was by Oklahoma City's firefighters, Team 5, was fading. And it says, we search for the truth, we seek justice, the court requires it, the people cry for it, and God demands it. I said, we can't ever let that go away.
So we repainted.
We
And it's
repainted
been
it
done
after
several
his
times.
conviction came in and guilty, and that he was given the death penalty. But anyway, and then we repainted it a few years ago with Team 5. It was really a cold winter
many of them had
day. It was
retired.
a cold winter day, but
Yeah, I remember that.
it really said it all.
But I think it's really important to note that the PTSD, the real jarring experience for so many of these people, will be a lifetime challenge for them. We don't think about that, but that's why it's so wonderful to have the Oklahoma City Community Foundation handling the investment of these funds and distributing them to people who do need mental health counseling and other services.
When I think those funds have now all been used, I think they're all gone.
Oh no, they're still, the corpus is still there, the exact amount that was raised, which shows you how well invested it was, because the corpus is still there. But what's an example of that was that, and it shows again the spirituality and the kindness of Oklahoma City. Anybody who was discovered, the team would come from their organization or agency and take them out and take them to wherever those bodies were taken. But in any event, in one case, my twin brother was a Marine officer. I saw a leg, blue pants, red stripe, and a polished black shoe under the rubble. And I said, well, that's obviously a Marine officer, and it probably was the recruiter. Well, that's exactly who it was, but I didn't know his name and I didn't see him. Well, when we came back, this was years and years later, and when you exit the museum, you see all the faces of all these people. I looked, and here was he had an Hispanic name, Guzman was his name, Captain Guzman, and 28 years old. And I walked over, saw his name, saw his face, and just broke down crying. And that's going to continue for a lot of people. And you just wonder whatever happened to his family. Did he have a family? Did he have any children? But he obviously was a hero. And his case can be duplicated time after time in terms of a life of service and sacrifice. And so many of those people were, in fact, heroes. Or little people and others who didn't have a chance to be heroes because their lives were snuffed out by that evil McVeigh before they had an opportunity to flourish and bloom.
Governor Keating, you noted in the preface to the book that there was not a single act of looting following the bombing. Why do you think that was?
Well, I think that's important because think about most man-made disasters. And a number, in many cases, bad people want to take advantage of it. Look at the looting that goes on after tornadoes or hurricanes. And it does happen. There were 302 buildings damaged or destroyed in downtown Oklahoma City, and there wasn't one act of looting. That's
or
violence. That's also an example of the Oklahoma Standard. And that's been said to me over and over again, that you just didn't see behavior that would be considered offensive. These were our brothers and sisters who were injured and killed, and we embraced them. And an example, obviously, of embracing them is that there was no criminal conduct during that period of time.
I think for several days there was no criminal activity, according to the police department, at all. I mean, everything just went quiet. Right. The Bank of Oklahoma it's about a block away from the Murrah Building. And so all the employees evacuated immediately because of the danger. And they thought that there were copycat people calling in saying, there's another bomb going off. So they just walked out the door, left all the money in the drawers, left the vault open, full of money. And they came back the next morning, front doors were wide open. Not one penny was missing. And again, I just think that, I think all of Oklahoma, whether you were a family member or whatnot, or whether you indulged in criminal activity, I think everybody was so stunned by what happened that everybody let their best side come forward.
Right. And that is all a fact. I mean, that's not made up.
This viewer says, I learned that you organized the International Prayer Service. How hard was it to pull something of this magnitude together so quickly while honoring the diverse faiths of all those involved?
Well, the day of April 19th, Frank was mentioned
No,
earlier.
I want you to know, and I got in trouble because I came back into the house. I was emotionally a wreck, and I heard this conversation going on the second floor, and I walked in. I said, "Oh, are we having fun?" I mean, I just was. What is everybody sitting around talking for? And Kathy looked at me and she said, "We are planning a memorial service, a prayer service, and you can leave."
Well, I didn't say it quite like
No, I know.
But the truth is, there were 5 of us that I called at 9:30, and we hadn't lived in Oklahoma City for a little over 3 months. So Debbie Snodgrass helped call Gail and Barney Simpner and Sam Armstrong, and Debbie came over and we started talking about putting together a prayer service, which we wanted to do on Friday, but we couldn't do that because the convention center was going to be host to the bed and breakfast that I referred to for the FEMA workers. The fairgrounds there was a horse show there. So the memorial service was moved to Sunday, and we just all started putting our heads together, planning what we wanted, and Philharmonic was called, asked to perform. They did all the copyright releases that they had to do because it was going to be televised. You have to get copyright releases. We invited the Ambassador Choir to sing. They were going to be
From here in Oklahoma City, just a
revival.
wonderful gospel choir.
And they were performing at a revival, and I asked them, I said, please, please, please. And they said they couldn't. So we asked Canterbury, and we didn't know who was in the building. So we wanted it to be a multi-faith endeavor. We had a Jewish rabbi, we had an evangelical preacher from Tulsa, Carlson Pearson, or David Packman was the rabbi from Oklahoma City, Carlton Pearson from Tulsa, Billy Graham, who kind of represents all faiths, and the Catholic Archbishop. And we just wanted it to be representative of every single race, sex, faith, nationality, because we just didn't know who was in that building. And we wanted to celebrate all of their family members. And as we hoped when we planned it that we would be rescuing them. That afternoon, we went from rescue to recovery. And there was no one else pulled out alive. But everybody
How many people
just
watched that, Ken?
worked. And I should mention the florists and the funeral directors, because all the flowers were free. We had no cost. The fairgrounds waived the cost. None, because we didn't have any money. And the CNN reporter did the feed. They had one camera in there to feed to everybody, every other news station. And the next day, we were doing media down at the bombing site. And the CNN reporter said to me, "Have you heard how many people were viewing this?" And I said, "No." And he said it was the most widely watched television show in the history of television from people all over the world.
Mm-hmm.
And I went, "Really?" So the world was really grieving with us. It was a loss of innocence for America and a loss of innocence for the world, because we go into other countries to help them. We never had to help ourselves like this.
You both have authored books apart from one another. Do you find writing cathartic?
It's hard. I'm not sure about cathartic. No, I went to school in Tulsa, a Cassia Hall, which was an Augustinian Catholic school, and I had a priest teacher named Father Gaffney, and he just was intolerant of anybody who would end a sentence in a preposition. But when I went to college, I had a creative writing course, and I got a D on my paper. And I went into the professor's office. I said, "Professor, I'm very upset. I got a D in the paper." I was a freshman. And I was a co-editor of my newspaper in high school, and how can I get a D? And he picked up my paper and he said, "Did you write this?" I said, "Yes, I did." And he said, "Well, then you write like a girl." And I went, "Well, how does a girl write?" And he said, "Too many adjectives, too many adverbs." And he pulled out from his desk a book and he put it in front of me. He said, "Have you read this?" It was Ernest Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea. And I said, "Yes, sir, I have." And he said, "Then read it again and write like he does." So when I write, particularly young readers' books, that's what I do. I have as few adjectives and adverbs as I can. I try to be very factual, but every word is a word a young reader could understand. And I've done a number on the founders and figures in American history. And it's so much fun to do that.
And you're selling yourself short. You are the most incredible writer. You just start and you write with ease. Now, I don't write with ease. I'm mission driven. If I see a need, then that's what motivates me to do really most anything in life. But the need was we needed to tell the Oklahoma City story, the bombing, from our perspective. We didn't need outside people to come in and tell our story. And so it was a collaboration with 5 volunteer writers who spent 6 weeks in the basement of the Capitol in their name. And then we moved into a house that didn't have a permanent collection of furnishings and everything was kind of broken when Frank became governor. And so I went to the library looking for a book on governor's mansions, and there was only one such book, but it showed a picture of the outside, a picture of their capitals, called Mansions and Capitals. Nothing about, how they were furnished, how they used history or anything. So I decided I'd figure it out, and then we'd do a book on our governor's mansions. Kind of the 25th anniversary. There was, that story needed to be told. And so because of that, it was the motivating factor for Frank and me. Frank and I are collaborating on another book, but we're trying to decide whether it's going to be fiction or nonfiction. I want it to be nonfiction. I want it to be fiction. He wants it to be nonfiction. But
to be continued.
So, his writing motivates him. Something else motivates me to tell a story.
Do you have any new books planned in your Leaders series?
Not right now, because I did one on Washington, one on Abraham Lincoln, one on Theodore Roosevelt, one on Hamilton.
What about John Adams?
Well, no, that's kind of on hold. They've decided the issue is, should we finish the Mount Rushmore series with Jefferson? And a lot of people want to pause on that. But then the Trial of Standing Bearer.
That book's written and illustrated. It's ready to go.
Oh, Mike Wimmer is the artist for all of my books, except this one, of course, are children artists. But Wimmer is always raring to go. And I've just got a lot of other things going, but we'll see. The latest was Alexander Hamilton. And of course, in the era of Hamilton, that's a big deal. And all those presidential books are in the first person, which is fun. And for, young readers, 9, 12 years old, in that age group, and a lot of people enjoy reading.
Simon & Schuster came to him about doing a book on John Adams, and he started doing the research. And I said, no, we need to do Abigail. And I'll collaborate with you to do Abigail.
And that's not a bad suggestion.
And they said, maybe after John Adams, we could do Abigail. But a female needs to help write Abigail and give us the perspective. Because, young children need women to look up to and admire. And she certainly was a strong leader. But
Okay, we have time for one more question. This is for Governor Keating. Have you thought about writing your autobiography or letting someone else write your biography? Who would write your biography? Would Cathy write your biography?
It'd have lots of adjectives.
There's a lot of adjectives and adverbs in that one. Well, I remember years ago when I was in school, I read a book about the authors of the Constitution. And one chapter was an individual that I'd never heard of. One chapter was an individual who really did not do a whole lot in life, as it was reported. And the author was just devastating. And he's concluded by this little paragraph, ignoring everything else to give this guy's moment in the sun. And it said, and he died as he had lived and passed from obscurity into oblivion. When you're an ex-public official, when you're an ex-leader, you almost have moved from obscurity into oblivion. But I love humor. And so
and that has gotten him in trouble in the past.
But I wrote my autobiography myself, and it's filled with, I think, hilarious anecdotes and stories that are all true in my life, children and relatives and politics and travel and all that stuff. Probably, I think it's about 260 pages. But a friend of mine read it and he said, "Ooh, this is too hot to publish."
And he hasn't let me read.
Yeah, I think it's great, but it probably is.
I probably axed some of the colorful parts, maybe. But he's had two really prolific authors approach him. Bob Burke's one of them. Yeah. And our son-in-law Ryan Leonard has said he'd like to do something. Books with Bob Burke. And Bob Blackburn mentioned something years ago about doing something with his great Oklahoman, and said, "Let us tell it from our perspective, not from your perspective."
It's fun. Everybody comes at it from a different direction, and things that are dry to the average person would be dry to me as an author. I know I wrote a book and never published it called The Crook Book, and it's a story of the life and times of the Honorable Horatio Hack, obviously all made up, about corrupt county officials in Oklahoma. I was United States Attorney at the time, prosecuting people. And I mean, I've given it to several people to read, and they just cried laughing. They said, "This is hilarious. Just think this really happened." And so, but mine is, there's a lot of factual stuff, interesting stuff, because I worked for Reagan and H.W. Bush, and
we've had
a great life.
Wonderful life.
I'm not sure anybody would want to read the story, but it's been fun.
I'm sure they would. Well, I want to thank both of you for being with us today and giving up your afternoon. And thank you, and have a great day.
Thank you so much, Jenny. And thank you, everybody, for watching.
Yes, thank you.